time in Adelaide, there were a lot of programs to help identify kids that may be interested in the arts. So, and there was a guy, Dave Brown, who I probably certainly wouldn't be here today if he hadn't had his opportunities as well in Adelaide in that time to work with initially kids in the southern suburbs of Adelaide who were talented in the arts. And in my years, he moved it to the program to the northern suburbs, and kids who were in high schools that didn't necessarily have strong drama programs were able to, outside of school hours and things, work with similar-minded kids and have opportunities to sort of build and make shows. And it was sort of supported by the education department at the time, kind of thing that would probably never happen today, but it was fantastic that it did. And that combined with the thing which was the SA Youth Theatre Company, at a similar time in Adelaide, they had a number of youth theatre companies, orchestras, choirs. There was a lot of that kind of activity that was happening. And they gave me opportunities to do things that probably I had no particular skills in yet. So I was probably 16 when I directed a show for the first time. Graduated high school quite young and went to a couple of years in university. And then when I was 18, turning 19, I did a production in Adelaide of a Stephen Sondheim musical called Merrily We Roll Along. And that was seen by a guy who was running WAPA, the Academy of Performing Arts in WA, almost purely as an accident. A couple of his students were in it.
Yes.
And I got this sort of call out of the blue, just sort of saying, would you be interested in coming and doing a postgraduate directing course at WAPA? We've never had a music theatre director come and do it. And I wasn't even a graduate of anything, so I probably shouldn't have started a postgraduate course. But in the mid-90s, went to WAPA for a couple of years to do music theatre directing. Yep. And from there, I met Roger Hodgman, who was another really big influence on me early in my career and in learning about directing, but also how to lead an organisation. He was the artistic director of Melbourne Theatre Company. And when I was around 21 or 22, he gave me a job, look, mostly as his assistant. So he was both running the company and directing quite a few shows. So I did some sort of like schools company touring and directed touring productions, but mostly assisted him so that he could run the company as well as be doing shows at that time. I was there for a couple of years. Wanted to move into commercial musical theatre, so I moved to Sydney, worked with Kevin Jacobson. A lot of people would know as Colin Joy's brother. Has been a very big, used to run the entertainment centre in Sydney. Yes. When I moved, he was doing Beauty and the Beast, which I was coming on board theoretically to tour that into Asia, which never really happened. I had a weird experience working with Kevin. I think there were more shows we started that didn't happen than started and did. Yes. So there was that sort of didn't happen, and Jekyll and Hyde twice with Kevin we almost did. That I was working on. I did this sort of weird production called Gale Force Dance that was sort of Riverdance meets Xena the Warrior Princess. It was a very strange thing he picked up. So I did that for a while, but what I thought I was there to do was to help him develop new musicals, which was kind of my love. Yep. And he, I seemed to realize what I was really there to do is to act as kind of a filter between Kevin and the people that wanted him to do that kind of stuff. He was a very popular kind of guy and didn't really want to give people bad news. So there were things that would come across his desk that he wasn't that interested in, and I could sort of act as a barrier, but I still wanted to actually do shows. Yeah. So I moved back to Melbourne, sort of the late 90s, and by that stage, I wanted to do two things. That in sort of the late 90s, everything that had been kind of a street fair or a school fete suddenly started being called festivals. We had this amazing rise in festivals in Australia in the lead up to both the Olympics and the Millennium. And when I came back, it was partly because people in Melbourne, some organisations just offered me some gigs producing these festivals, because suddenly there were more events than there were competent people. No one really had the skills yet. Yep. So I came back and did my day job for probably 2 or 3 years there. I was doing quite a lot of them. I did the Lygon Street Festival for 2 or 3 years. I did a bunch of stuff with the Maya Music Bowl, which was going through a renovation at that point. So we helped them do some of their bigger things with the Australian Ballet and stuff in other venues. And I did the Waterfront Festival in Geelong and Williamstown Festival, a whole bunch of things like that. But while at the same time, I was still focusing on developing new musicals, which was where I wanted a lot of my attention to be. And there was a show that we did at Chapel Off Chapel. It was really quite successful, called Prodigal Son, written by Dean Bryant and Maddie Frank. And that was picked up to transfer to New York, but they didn't want any of the Australian creative team. I was a bit sort of annoyed by that, because when the reverse occurred, you would always get Americans, some barely qualified, that would come to Australia and direct transferring productions. And I thought the same thing should eventually exist in reverse. And I'd been to New York a couple of times by then. I had a Churchill Fellowship and went on this thing called the Murdoch Prize for 3 months, which was one of the last nice things that Rupert Murdoch did. So I'd been in New York a fair bit and thought, look, this is probably my occasion to leave. I really should go, and if I'm ever going to, it needs to be now.
Yeah.
So I broke up with my partner of the time, which was very sad, though we're both still very good friends.
Yeah.
She wanted to stay in Australia. Sold everything we owned in a garage sale, which probably speaks to the lack of things we owned.
Yeah.
I had 2 suitcases and I moved to New York. And that first year in New York was probably the hardest year in my life.
Yeah.
Because I went there, I actually knew a fair few people, but didn't really realise that a lot of the arts industry in New York exists on the fact that people are willing to do stuff for close to nothing.
Yeah.
You know, because what you do in New York eventually leads to other things elsewhere, especially in America. So my first year, I was doing things and I was like, oh, how do anyone pays the bills? But luckily, I did a big gala event for a small non-profit there that did quite well. I knew how to produce big concerts and galas, festivals. And they said, this went really well. Now I've got a bunch of extra money, unexpected money in the bank. We'll give you a full-time job. We've been recruiting for an executive director. I want you to do that. It was the National Music Theatre Network. And after being there for a few months, I was like, I don't really know how this place is going to keep paying the bills. It was all focused on new musical development, but very non-public facing, very workshop based, relied on a lot of donations. And I didn't think it was going to work. And at that time, Urinetown had recently been quite a big success in the New York Fringe. It transferred to Broadway, and a lot of musicals were workshopping in the Fringe in New York, which wasn't a very good model. So I sort of pitched to a bunch of friends that, why don't we start the New York Musical Theatre Festival? And we'll do it in this period around sort of August, September, when people are coming back, late August into September, people are coming back from summer holidays. A lot of the theatres haven't reopened yet. Things are in rehearsal, but a lot of the theatres are still looking for product. And we launched that in 2005 with no money in the bank. It was just sort of, in hindsight, it was mostly just bluster and a Ponzi scheme. It was kind of like, well, let's just keep moving forward. And it'll either go or it won't, you know. We'll get to a point where we have to make a decision, and if things still look good, we'll proceed. And we just kept talking about it like it was happening, and everyone kept saying, great, let's do it. And I was like, people seem very supportive of this. And that launched in 2005, and its first year was very successful. There was a backlog of musicals that wanted to get limited seasons, but full productions. And that was able to happen in like a showcase model within this festival. Many transferred to off-Broadway and Broadway. It was really successful. And I ran that for the next 5 years in New York. By then, I was getting a little bit burnt out. I just needed to kind of recharge my battery. I sort of wanted to come home, but I also just I needed something that was going to be less just physically and emotionally draining. And one of the kind of board advisors, people associated with the festival then, was a guy, Stephen Schwartz, who had just written a musical on Broadway that was going really well. And a friend of mine in Australia was going to produce the Australian production of it, a guy called John Frost. And I'd seen, this is Wicked, and I'd seen Wicked with John. We'd actually gone before we had the option to do it in Australia. We'd gone at a steak afterwards and talked about how good it could be and blah, blah, blah. And so they both reached out and said, we're doing this in Australia. We want an Australian who can help be part of the team back there. Would you want to come home for it? And I sort of ummed and ahed, but it was probably the ideal thing for me because it was a really good way to transition back to Australia. It paid really well. Everyone on that show made good money because it was making money hand over fist. But after probably only 4 months or so, I started to get a bit bored. I was recharged. Wanted to start doing other things and started looking at other things to do. Eventually the show was going to transfer to Sydney and I said I wouldn't go with it. And they very generously said, if you travel with the show to Sydney, we'll release you to start doing other things. And at that stage, I had some friends in Sydney and they'd been working with the city of Sydney trying to launch. Well, firstly, with the Australia Council around launching a thing that was New Musicals Australia, which eventually became, I worked a little bit with Lisa and David and Neil at the beginning of the Haze. I couldn't stay with it just because of later things that happened in moving to Brisbane. But a lot of some of the programs we started ended up at the Haze Theatre in Sydney, including New Musicals Australia, which I sort of ran for 2 or 3 years in Sydney. And around a similar time, the City of Sydney wanted to launch a big event for alternative artists in Sydney. So we sort of said to them, we went back and forth about what we thought they were looking for. And eventually one day we're having a conversation. I said, I think you want a fringe festival. You just feel weird about saying it. It's a fringe festival. That's okay. You can have that in Sydney. And so we launched the Sydney Fringe in, I couldn't even tell you when that was, maybe 2010, 2009. Must be at least that, 2010, 2011, something like that. And I did that for 2.5 years. Around a similar time, I got offered a chance to do a thing with the Festival of Voices in Hobart. They were looking for a big winter destination event. So we talked about some opportunities there, and they'd had this sort of like large scale sort of singing workshops and stuff happening there. And I was like, look, I think if you took that, added a little bit of cabaret festival, added a little bit of festival of ideas, made it substantially bigger, that could be a great magnet in winter to bring people in. Did that for 3 festivals, and was approached, funnily enough, about QMF, and I went through the Queensland Music Festival, went through a long process with that. I didn't get that job. It was sort of down to me and one other person. And I was like, oh, well, that's fair enough, you know. But only a few weeks later, the person who was doing the recruiting said, look, a few of the people on the board have just kept talking about some of the ideas you pitched, and there's a different opportunity in Brisbane running an arts venue there called the Brisbane Powerhouse. And a lot of the stuff you were talking about wanting to empower local artists and wanting to create where the legacy really exists in what you can do locally, that you can really belong, that you should transform depending on what the community and of artists and audiences need. That's where their head is at as well. So I reckon if we brought you in to speak to those guys, they'd really like you. And that was that. Spent the next 8 years at Brisbane Powerhouse, had the time of my life, and as of a week ago, announced that I was finishing up there with the 21st birthday last week, I guess. That finished on a Saturday, the 21st, and on the Monday, I'd announced that I'd taken up a position as Chief Executive of QMUSIC, which is Queensland's peak body for the live music industry.